Abandoned in a desolate canyon, the starved Mustang's only hope was to cling to life with every trembling breath. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. He stood, ribs jutting like jagged rocks through his dusty coat, nostrils flaring in search of the faintest sign of water or forage. Every painful breath drew in the hot, dry air that scorched the inside of his throat, and each exhale left him trembling as his strength ebbed away. The ruthless rancher who had driven him into this dead-end canyon had done so with a cold sneer, leaving the Mustang behind a crudely mended fence. Deep tire tracks vanished toward the distant horizon. There was no water trough, no bale of hay tossed as a farewell gesture, only the unrelenting sun overhead and the scorched ground beneath his cracked hooves. The Mustang's eyes, once bright with the spirited fire of a wild horse, now dulled with growing desperation. Somewhere high above, a lone hawk circled, the only witness to the Mustang's torment. The day was unbearably still. Sharp rocks littered the canyon floor, each step a trial that cut into his weakening legs. The wind had died down, leaving a stifling hush that pressed in like an invisible weight. The fence that trapped him had been pieced together with barbed wire and splintery boards. He tested it with a faint push of his muzzle, but his parched body couldn't muster enough power to break through. His ears flicked at the distant growl of a coyote. The sound caused a tremor of alarm along his lean flanks. He didn't see them yet, but he knew the predators were out there, undoubtedly drawn by the scent of an easy kill. Summoning what was left of his energy, the horse tried to move around the perimeter, seeking an escape. Each step forward kicked up swirling dust that clung to the sweat streaked into his coat. Hunger gnawed at his gut, thirst scorched his every nerve. His body was failing, but the drive to survive overrode everything else. The sun sat at a cruel zenith, pouring down so much heat that the ground shimmered in waves. Hours slipped by, and the Mustang's tongue felt like sandpaper inside his mouth. Sometimes, a small puff of wind provided the faintest promise of change, but it was only enough to stir the dust around him. The horse's breath rasped, harsh and uneven, his flanks heaving. Despair threatened to settle in, a cold wave despite the searing heat, yet an ember of instinct told him to keep going. He'd survived fierce storms and predators in the wild. He was no stranger to hardship. Even though his spirit had been battered, it wasn't extinguished. Far off, a thunderhead loomed in the otherwise endless blue sky, its dark mass creeping forward with ominous patience. The Mustang's ears pricked toward it, picking up the distant rumble. Hope and dread mingled as he recognized the sound of thunder. Rain could offer salvation, but a sudden storm in this rocky canyon could just as easily turn lethal. Yet the Mustang didn't possess the luxury of choice. He needed water in any form, even if it came with the threat of flash floods and lightning strikes. The hours crawled. As the sun slid west, shadows lengthened across the canyon floor. The fence that had imprisoned him seemed to stretch endlessly, each attempt to find a gap leading to a dead end. He kicked feebly at a loose post, but his weakened muscles refused to lend any meaningful force. A dull clang of shifting metal made his ears pin back. The barbed wire rattled, and though it didn't give way, the vibrations frightened something behind the boards, a small snake that slithered out into the open in a flash of panic, vanishing into a crevice. In the past, the Mustang might have reared or jumped back, but now he barely shifted, his eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. A crow landed on a rock outcropping, feathers glinting like black oil in the sunlight. It watched him with curious eyes, cawing once into the still air. The Mustang flicked his ears, unsure whether to view the bird as a herald of more trouble. Not far away, the coyote howls echoed again. The sound raised every hair along the horse's spine. He knew they were gathering. They always did when they caught the scent of vulnerability. They could close in under the cover of night, or even in broad daylight if hunger urged them. Each second felt precarious. The Mustang's breath stayed shallow, but his heart pounded a stubborn rhythm. As the sun's edge neared the jagged skyline, the day relinquished some of its burning intensity, making way for a sudden drop in temperature. Desert climates could be unforgiving in both extremes. The horse felt his knees start to buckle, and he had to concentrate not to collapse. He needed to keep moving, keep searching. If he lay down, there might be no getting up again. Step by step, he forced himself forward. Gravel slid under his weight, and every so often a sting of pain shot up his legs from stepping on a sharp stone. Still, he pressed on, muzzle trailing close to the ground, hoping to catch a whiff of moisture or vegetation. A cruel reality set in as he reached a corner of the fence where the canyon wall shot up sheer and tall. There was no water, no hidden spring, no trickling creek. Just more rock, more dust, more hopeless barriers. The rancher had chosen this spot deliberately, ensuring the Mustang would find no refuge. Lightning pulsed in the distance, a jagged slash across the darkening sky. A gust of wind rattled the fence, tossing grit into the horse's face. He coughed, blinking against the dirt swirling in his tired eyes. Yet with that wind came the faintest scent of rain. It drifted on the cooling air, making the Mustang's nostrils flare in desperate yearning. He tried again to force himself against the weakened post, hoping the elements might have loosened something since the rancher's departure. The wood groaned but didn't yield. With a frustrated whicker that cracked in his parched throat, he backed off, nearly stumbling. Darkness sank over the canyon. Shapes and sounds took on menacing forms as night creatures stirred. The coyote chorus resumed, louder this time, sending adrenaline jolting through the Mustang's weakened limbs. Instinct screamed for vigilance. The night would be dangerous. He paced, fighting off the desire to simply collapse. The fences, tall canyon walls, and jagged boulders on all sides pressed down on his mind, a claustrophobic trap with no mercy. Flickers of lightning grew brighter, accompanied by rolling thunder that echoed off the rocky walls like a drumbeat of doom. The horse's ears swiveled, tracking the intensifying storm. Maybe if he was lucky, the deluge would fill a depression in the rock, offering something to drink. But with that water would come flash floods, a surge of muddy torrent that could easily sweep him away if he was caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. A hush of heavy air fell, that tense moment before a storm unleashes its fury. The Mustang lifted his muzzle, droplets speckling his face. He barely believed it at first. Actual rain. A soft patter turned into a sudden cascade, big cold drops striking the ground and raising puffs of dust. He opened his mouth, letting the rain roll off his muzzle, tongue twitching to lap up every precious drop. Though the water tasted like dust and iron, it was water nonetheless. He drank what he could from the air, from the runnels that formed on the flat stones. Relief warred with anxiety as the storm quickly escalated. Thunder boomed directly overhead, causing the horse to pin his ears and toss his head in alarm. He stumbled back from the fence, eyes wild with a sudden burst of energy born of fear. The ground quaked under the shock of the thunder, or so it felt to his trembling legs. Lightning forks illuminated the canyon in stark white flashes, revealing the sheer walls and the feeble fence line that looked more fragile with each burst of brightness. Then came the downpour, a torrent so heavy it roared against the rocks, carving instant rivulets through the dirt. The Mustang skidded around a deeper section of ground that began to pool with rushing water. Mud formed beneath him, threatening to swallow his hooves. Without warning, a surge of brown floodwater barreled around the bend, churning with debris, branches, stones, whatever it picked up in its unstoppable path. The horse scrambled, sides heaving as the water reached his legs, forcing him to move or risk being knocked off balance. Thunder's roar mixed with the hiss of the rain, making it impossible to hear the coyotes now. The fence shuddered and creaked where the floodwater pressed against it, the barbed wire bowed out by the force. For a moment, a glimmer of hope ignited in the Mustang's eyes. If the flood tore away enough of that fence, he might escape. But that hope was balanced by terror. The water rose, swirling around his hocks. He braced, half blind from the rain hammering his face. Lightning struck somewhere on the ridge, sending a shower of sparks. He neighed in terror, rearing halfway, hooves flailing at the wall of water rushing by. The momentum of the flood changed direction, swirling eddies forming around boulders. Rocks battered the fence, boards snapped. The horse saw an opening appear, a gap where the flood had torn loose part of the barrier. He fought to reach it, each step a struggle against the surge of churning water. He slipped. His front legs buckled in the mud, and he crashed shoulder first into the swirling mess. A moment of raw panic flared through him as he realized he might be swept away. Gathering every ounce of strength, he kicked out, scrambled back up, and pressed forward, straining toward the torn fence. Mud caked his legs. The water forced him sideways. Another crack of lightning overhead, another blast of thunder. The boards near the gap wobbled in the current, barbed wire snapping at the air like some venomous serpent. The Mustang lunged, seizing the opportunity. He felt the sting of barbs cut across his flank, leaving a searing pain as the wire snagged him. But he pressed on, yanking free with a whinny of defiance, ignoring the blood and the agony. He stumbled onto a patch of higher ground just beyond the fence line, panting, water streaming off his drenched coat. For a moment, he realized he was free of that prison. The storm raged, but at least he was no longer trapped in that fenced-in death trap. The joy of freedom warred with the shock of pain from the wire's cut. He could taste blood mixed with rain on the air, and his right flank throbbed, but he had escaped. Yet the canyon was still a maze of flooding gullies and raging currents, and the storm showed no sign of abating. He turned, ears flicking back. Through the sheets of rain, he saw glowing eyes, coyotes still there, stalking him. They hung back, cautious of the swirling flood, but they were persistent. Maybe they sensed his wounded state. Maybe they were simply driven by hunger. Either way, they followed, shadows within the night, waiting for their chance. The Mustang snorted, stamping the ground. Even battered as he was, the primal desire to survive overshadowed any terror. He squealed in challenge, hoping to scare them off. The sound was lost in the storm's roar. Another wave of lightning revealed 3, maybe 4, coyote shapes creeping along the ridges. Pressing forward, the horse limped over jagged stones and slippery ground, forging his way deeper into the canyon. The water collecting on every surface provided him with a chance to quench his thirst. Lowering his head as he moved, he took quick gulps of muddy water, so desperate for fluid that he didn't mind its taste or the risk of contaminants. Each swallow revitalized him just enough to keep going. Eventually, the canyon walls twisted, and he discovered a narrow ledge above the worst of the floodwaters. He clambered onto it, wincing at the pain in his flank. The coyote howls rose and fell, always near enough to keep his heart pounding. The horse stood trembling in the deluge, eyes scanning for any path that might lead to a safer elevation or out of this maze of stone. The rancher had picked a near-perfect prison. Even the glimpses of freedom were overshadowed by new threats. Thunder seemed to crack the sky open. Rain slammed the canyon in unrelenting sheets. Rocks dislodged from the heights above, tumbling down and splashing into the raging water. Every nerve was on alert, every muscle straining to stay upright in the storm. But somehow, he kept going. Each step was a testament to the stubbornness of life, the refusal to surrender even when logic said it might be the only merciful end. He could barely see, night fully set in, everything illuminated only by fleeting bursts of lightning. The Mustang's breath came in ragged gasps, steam curling from his nostrils in the cooler air. His hooves felt numb from cold and continuous impact against stone. Yet he pressed on, hugging the ledge, hearing the roar of floodwater below. At a bend, the ledge rose to a small slope that led into a cluster of boulders. He navigated around them, nearly blind. The storm's wrath was relentless. The wind tugged at his mane and tail with savage force. Then, as quickly as it had come, the drenching rain began to ease, and the thunder rolled off into the distance. The horse could still see the storm's might in the flickering sky, but it moved away. The flash flood, however, remained below, its muddy currents twisting through the canyon floor. Exhaustion set in. The Mustang's legs threatened to buckle for good this time. But he forced himself to stay upright, to keep moving. If he stopped, the coyotes would catch him. If he hesitated, thirst or hunger would eventually claim him. Instinct demanded one unending command: survive. He didn't know how many hours passed as he stumbled in and out of the canyon's winding pathways. Occasionally, he managed another mouthful of water from a puddle or a trickle running down the rocks. Lightning continued to dance on the horizon, giving fleeting glimpses of the rocky labyrinth. At one point, the ledge narrowed dangerously. The horse paused, trembling, not sure if he could pass without slipping off into the churning torrent below. A coyote yipped behind him, too close for comfort. Heart pounding, he lunged forward, hooves scrabbling for purchase. He nearly slipped, sending rocks tumbling into the flood. But somehow, he found traction, pulling himself across to a wider path. The coyotes, deterred by the precarious route, held back, but only for the moment. As dawn started to break, gray light revealed the canyon in all its battered aftermath. Debris from the flash flood was strewn everywhere: tangled branches, uprooted shrubs, random junk carried from who knew how far upstream. The Mustang's coat was caked with drying mud, sticky and matted. Blood streaked his side where the barbed wire had cut him. His ribs still stood out sharply beneath his hide, evidence of days, or perhaps longer, without real nourishment. The storm might have saved him by damaging the fence, but it also drained him further. He was running on the last fumes of energy and spirit. Up ahead, the canyon walls opened slightly into a wider basin. Scattered tufts of grass, battered by the storm, were visible in small patches. The horse's nostrils flared hopefully. Grass, even soggy and half-flattened, meant sustenance. He limped toward it, mindful of the uneven ground. With careful steps, he reached one patch and lowered his head to tear at the blades, chewing slowly. Each mouthful was a meager victory, a morsel of life. His jaws trembled with fatigue, but the sweetness of living green coaxed him to continue. Meanwhile, the coyotes lurked at the edges, perhaps still waiting, but for now they seemed more cautious in broad daylight. A new challenge lay in the Mustang's path. The basin gradually sloped back into the deeper canyon. The water from the storm, though receding, had carved a new channel of slick mud. If he tried to cross while this area was still drenched, he risked becoming stuck or injuring himself. Yet the coyotes might use the easier terrain along the higher ridges to encircle him. He glanced around for an escape route that offered safer footing. Each movement was agony, but he forced himself to search. He noticed a faint trail leading up a crumbling slope. Possibly a path used by mountain goats or bighorn sheep. It was steep, littered with loose rocks, but it might lead out of the canyon entirely. If he could reach open ground, he could run again, if his legs still had any strength. The Mustang snorted, swallowing another mouthful of grass. Every swallow of nourishment sparked a bit more determination. He watched the coyotes, who paced along a ridge, whining and sniffing the wind. They weren't giving up, but neither were they rushing in. They probably sensed the fight still left in him. A horse was never easy prey, even a weak one, if cornered. Cautiously, he headed for the slope. With each step, pebbles rolled away under his hooves. More than once, he froze, thinking a landslide might start. The wound on his flank stung with renewed intensity, wet tracks of blood streaking the mud. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but he continued upward. The advantage of height might keep the predators at bay. He climbed steadily, sides heaving. The rocky path forced him to pick his way carefully. Fragments of stone clattered behind him, skittering down into the canyon below. Halfway up, he paused on a narrow ledge where the path took a sharp turn. Panting, he could see the basin below, the swirling mud still draining away, the scattered debris from the flood. He also spotted the coyotes picking their way across the rocks, trying to stay on his trail. He pinned his ears and stomped a hoof, a display of defiance even though he was near his limit. The coyotes paused, possibly wary of a well-placed kick. He took the moment to push onward, rounding the bend. The slope turned steeper, the wind picking up around him. Up above, the sky was still heavy with gray clouds, but the storm had moved on enough for pale sunlight to filter through. Pebbles crunched under his hooves, and at one spot, the ground nearly gave way, leaving him scrambling for purchase. A surge of adrenaline coursed through him, driving away the creeping numbness in his limbs. He pressed his body against the rocky face, hauling himself onto a slightly more stable portion of the path. Every muscle in his body quivered from exertion, but he refused to relent. Something deeper than mere survival seemed to guide him now, a refusal to let the rancher's cruelty, or the canyon's traps be his end. At last, he reached a wider ridge near the canyon's top. The view opened up to a vast stretch of rolling terrain, dotted with scattered brush and the distant promise of open plains. The Mustang's heart soared at the sight. Though his battered form begged for rest, a sliver of hope thrived in that endless expanse. He stepped forward, each motion a test of endurance. Somewhere, the coyote pack was still out there, but the advantage of the open ground was that he could potentially outrun them if he could regain some of his strength. He scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of immediate threats. The rancher was nowhere to be seen, nor was there any sign of help. It was just him, wounded but free, standing on the rocky edge of a canyon that had nearly claimed his life. A stiff breeze ruffled his muddy mane, carrying the lingering scent of rain and churned earth. The day felt strangely quiet now, the storm's roar replaced by a subdued hush. He limped along the ridge, slowly putting distance between himself and the canyon. As he walked, he kept an ear turned backward, listening for coyote cries. They echoed from time to time, but they seemed to grow more distant. Maybe they'd decided the chase was no longer worth it, or maybe they were circling around in a wide arc to try again. The Mustang had no illusions about safety. He would have to stay vigilant. But for the first time in too long, he could feel the air moving freely around him. He drank it in as though it were the sweetest nectar. A few hours later, the sun broke through the thinning clouds, warming his coat. The mud on his sides began to dry, forming cakey patches around the bloody cuts. His thirst remained intense, but the memory of the night's deluge reminded him that water might still be found in natural depressions or streams fed by the storm. With a cautious sense of optimism, he kept moving, searching the landscape. The days stretched on in this slow, agonizing trek. Occasionally, he paused to graze on tufts of grass or to sniff out pockets of water in rock formations. By afternoon, his strength had returned slightly, enough to carry him further from the canyon's rim. The land gradually changed, revealing a scattering of low shrubs and small stands of stunted trees. The Mustang's senses awoke. Where there were trees, there could be a trickle of a creek. Step by step, he descended a gentle slope toward a small grove of cottonwoods that rustled in the breeze. The ground underfoot felt cooler, more alive. He followed a subtle dip in the terrain, leading him to a shallow basin where storm runoff might have gathered. Joy jolted through him as his sensitive nose caught the scent of damp earth. Sure enough, a puddle glistened among the rocks, not large or deep, but enough to sustain a parched animal for a time. He waded forward, mud squelching around his hooves, and lowered his muzzle to drink. The water was murky from silt, but it was liquid, blessedly cool on his swollen tongue. He drank until he thought he might burst, feeling the dryness in his throat subside. Then he raised his head, water dripping from his muzzle, scanning his surroundings as clarity returned to his weary mind. Nearby, the cottonwoods offered some shade and a chance to rest without the full sun beating down. Carefully, mindful of his wounded flank, he approached the cluster of trees. His every instinct warned him to remain cautious, to keep an eye out for threats. But he could not go on without some moment of respite. He angled into a patch of shade where the grass grew a bit taller. Slowly, gingerly, he lowered his body to the ground, wincing at the pain in his side. The relief of taking the weight off his legs was immense. For the first time since the storm, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, to recover just a little. He dozed fitfully, ears pricking at every stray sound. Images flashed behind his closed eyelids, the rancher's sneering face as he was driven into that canyon, the roiling storm waters threatening to drown him, the barbed wire tearing at his flesh, and the unwavering eyes of the coyotes. Each memory brought a jolt of adrenaline, reminding him of the relentless nature of his predicament. He'd escaped one trap only to find himself in an endless wilderness, wounded and alone. Yet there was a stubborn spark within that refused to let him give in. As the sun edged toward late afternoon, he stirred and rose again, carefully testing his legs. The gash from the wire had congealed, though it still oozed slightly with movement. Flies buzzed around it, causing him to twitch his skin irritably. He needed to find a safer spot, perhaps a place with more consistent water and better grazing, if he was going to fully recover. Instinct led him to follow the slightest depressions in the land, hoping to trace them toward a larger source of water. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wild sage and damp soil. He limped forward, each step measured. The land spread out in rolling hills, dotted with scattered stones and lonely shrubs. Occasionally, he paused to nibble at a patch of grass, though none of it was particularly lush. The Mustang's thoughts, if thoughts they could be called, revolved around survival. Drink enough water, eat enough grass, keep moving to avoid predators. That was the immediate cycle. The idea of revenge against the rancher or trust in some distant benevolence was foreign in this primal mindset. Survival was the only directive. As dusk approached, he found another small waterhole in a shallow depression. He drank again, grateful for the day's occasional cloud cover that had prevented the puddles from evaporating entirely. The sky took on hues of pink and orange, a peaceful contrast to the previous night's chaos. The Mustang took a moment to rest near the waterhole, swiveling his ears to pick up any sign of danger. Crickets chirped in the growing twilight, and a few bats flitted overhead. When darkness fell, the air turned cool again, but the trauma of the previous night had taught him the desert could quickly become a place of predators and unpredictable hazards. He decided to press on, guided by moonlight that broke through the thinning clouds. His limp was still pronounced, and every so often he'd stumble on uneven ground, but determination drove him forward. The memory of those coyote eyes haunted him. He knew well that a horse alone was vulnerable. The only advantage was his size and strength, but in his weakened state, that advantage diminished. Hours passed in slow, laborious travel. The moon climbed high, painting the landscape in silver. Wind rustled through dry grasses. Occasionally, he heard distant howls or the scurrying of night creatures. Each time, his heart thumped faster, adrenaline rushing through his veins. His body ached, but he wouldn't lie down unless absolutely necessary. A primal sense warned him that lying down out in the open was a risk he couldn't afford. Around midnight, he found a natural windbreak formed by large boulders. He decided to pause, standing with his body partly sheltered, his head lowered in weary vigil. As dawn neared for the second time since his escape, the Mustang willed himself onward yet again. When the horizon brightened, he realized he'd come across a faint game trail. Hoofprints of deer or other grazers pressed into the drying mud. Perhaps they led to a more established water source. He followed them. The game trail wound around low hills, sometimes vanishing briefly, but always picking up again. The dryness of the air made him grateful for every puddle or trickle he encountered. Inch by inch, he put distance between himself and the canyon that had nearly spelled his doom. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of trudging, he noticed a subtle change in the vegetation. The shrubs became greener, the grass slightly taller. He caught the sound of trickling water. Excitement quickened his step. A narrow creek wound through a shallow ravine up ahead, fed by the recent storm and perhaps an underground spring. The water was clearer than the muddy puddles he'd been relying on. He walked right in, feeling the cool current swirl around his aching legs. Lowering his muzzle, he drank deeply, relief flooding his senses. Then he stood there, letting the gentle flow cleanse some of the dried mud and blood from his coat. Renewed by the creek, he found a nearby patch of decent grass. The sun rose higher, and for the first time in days, he felt some semblance of normalcy. A horse grazing by water under the open sky, free. The memory of the fence, the storm, and the predators lingered, but for now, he had a measure of peace. Flies still bothered the wound on his flank, and his ribs were starkly visible, but he could recover here, at least for a while. The day was warm, yet not unbearably so, thanks to the diminishing storm clouds that had left behind a mild overcast. He grazed slowly, tearing mouthfuls of fresh grass, allowing his body to absorb the nutrients it so desperately needed. Throughout the morning, he alternated between feeding and standing guard. The canyon wasn't far enough behind him to feel absolutely safe, but each hour that passed without incident helped him settle his nerves. Occasionally, a twig would snap in the distance, or a rabbit would dart out from under a bush, making him tense for an instant. But no coyotes emerged. The rancher who had left him to die was nowhere in sight. The Mustang had only his own vigilance, and the vastness of the wild around him. When midday came, the sun climbed higher, and he sought shade under a lone cottonwood near the creek. He stood there, dozing fitfully, tail swishing at insects, mind half lost in exhausted dreams. Visions of galloping across open prairies flashed through his memory, a time before human cruelty had penned him in. The recollection made his heart ache with longing, but it also stoked an ember of resolve. He would survive, if only to see that freedom again. As the afternoon wore on, the sound of wings beating overhead made him jerk his head up. A buzzard circled lazily in the sky, prompting a sense of unease. This part of the wilderness was no stranger to death. The horse flicked his ears, scanning the horizon. He saw nothing new, but a sense of restlessness settled in. Perhaps staying in one place for too long wasn't wise. Predators might track him. The rancher might decide to come looking. Gathering his courage, he left the cottonwood shade and followed the creek downstream. The wound on his flank, though partially crusted over, reopened slightly with the movement, sending a trickle of fresh blood down his side. He gritted his teeth, forging on. The terrain shifted again, the creek winding between gentle banks. He passed evidence of wildlife, deer tracks, raccoon prints, droppings of various creatures. The environment felt more alive, less desolate than the canyon he'd escaped. Grass grew taller in patches, a sign that the water here was more consistent. He drank at intervals, easing the persistent thirst that still lingered from the previous ordeal. Although exhaustion weighed on him, he felt a burgeoning determination. Maybe he could fully heal in this territory, become strong again. Maybe. The distant shape of a figure on horseback caught his eye. For a moment, panic seized him. Could it be the rancher? He froze, heart hammering, and ducked behind a slight rise in the ground, carefully peering out. The figure was a good distance away, moving slowly along the far side of the creek, scanning the horizon. He couldn't see details, but the silhouette wasn't the same as the rancher's imposing frame, and the horse beneath the rider looked different. Still, the Mustang had every reason to be wary. Humans had brought him nothing but pain. He remained motionless, ears pricked, watching the stranger. The figure paused, dismounted, and knelt by the water to let their horse drink. Then they turned their gaze, as though searching for something, or someone, in the wilderness. The Mustang's pulse raced. Was this person hunting him? Tracking him? The possibility sent a shot of adrenaline through his veins. But the stranger didn't cross the creek, didn't rush forward with a rope or call out. Instead, they rose slowly, patted their horse, and continued upstream, away from the Mustang. He watched them vanish around a bend, uncertain of what to make of the encounter. Relief mingled with curiosity. He'd always been wary of humans, but something about this lone rider's behavior seemed different from the cruelty he'd known. Still, caution ruled. He waited until he was sure the stranger was gone before venturing further downstream. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything in a golden hue. Despite his limping gait, he wanted to put as much distance as possible between himself and any human. Memories of the fence and the rancher's brutal sneer fueled his mistrust. He continued through the grassy banks, crossing the creek carefully at shallower points. The day wore on, and twilight once again approached. In the dying light, the horse found a slight rise in the terrain overlooking a broader part of the creek. The water glistened, reflecting the oranges and pinks of the sky. He paused to graze, taking advantage of the remaining sunlight. A mild breeze rustled the taller grasses, hinting at a shift in weather. He hoped the night would remain calm. Another storm was the last thing he needed. As stars began to emerge overhead, he stood guard, listening to the chirr of crickets and the distant croak of frogs near the water. His eyelids grew heavy. He ached in every muscle, and though the day had been kinder than the one before, he was still dangerously weak. Subdued moonlight bathed the land. He thought of lying down, but decided against it. Instead, he remained on his feet, dozing in that standing sleep horses had perfected. Occasionally, he jerked awake at the sound of a rustle or a distant coyote cry. This was the pattern for the night, snatches of rest interrupted by vigilance. The hours passed in a slow parade of quiet tension. When dawn broke, the Mustang's legs felt stiff and numb from constant standing. Gingerly, he shifted his weight, assessing the pain in his flank. It wasn't as sharp as before, though every movement still twinged. Hunger gnawed at him, but the abundance of grass near the creek helped sate it. The cut on his side needed time, but without human help, it would either heal on its own or become infected. Such was the gamble of the wild. He lowered his muzzle to tear fresh grass, each bite fueling his battered body. Mid-morning brought a new surprise. As he drifted downstream, the land opened into a wider valley. There, nestled among a grove of cottonwoods, lay a small cabin. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. A corral stood off to one side, with a couple of horses inside, munching hay. The Mustang froze. The presence of people set off alarm bells in his head. He pinned his ears back, considering bolting. But the smell of fresh hay and the sound of running water from a more established creek crossing tugged at his instincts. He craved rest and sustenance. Yet he couldn't risk capture. Crouching behind a thicket, as well as a horse can, only lowering his head and body slightly, he watched. A figure emerged from the cabin, perhaps the same rider he'd seen before. Their movements were slow, deliberate, lacking the harshness he associated with the rancher. They carried buckets of water to the corral, pausing to stroke the horses inside. The Mustang tensed. If he got too close, he could end up roped. If he stayed, he risked being seen. But something about the calm manner of this person made him linger, curiosity and a faint hope rising within him. He waited hidden for the better part of an hour. The person tended the horses, refilled the trough, then stepped back inside, leaving the corral gate latched but not locked with heavy chains. The Mustang sniffed the air. The faint scent of hay made his stomach clench with longing. Wariness battled with the pressing need for more than just sparse wild grass. He inched closer, pausing whenever the corral horses lifted their heads to watch him. They whickered softly, but didn't sound in alarm. Likely, they were tame and used to humans, yet they seemed intrigued by this muddy, wild stranger. The Mustang studied the corral fence. It was sturdy but not as tall as the canyon fence, and there was a gate. If he dared, he might slip in, snatch some hay, and run before anyone realized. But fear paralyzed him. What if this was another trap? What if the rancher was in league with this person? He hovered on the edge of decision, trembling in the morning sun. Then, the cabin door opened. He startled, ready to bolt, but instead of grabbing a rifle or a rope, the person stepped outside slowly, crouching down, extending a hand in the Mustang's direction. His eyes darted from the human to the horses in the corral. He considered running, but something in him hesitated. The man, yes, it was a man, didn't advance. He only waited, arm outstretched, voice carrying softly. The Mustang couldn't understand the words, but the tone wasn't threatening. Uncertainty raged inside the horse. He remembered the terror of the canyon, the sting of the barbed wire, the savage cruelty of the rancher. And yet, here was a human who seemed different, offering no immediate harm. An internal struggle played out. Fear nearly won. He took a few halting steps backward. But hunger and exhaustion dug their claws into him. The haze scent wafted over, and fresh water sparkled in the trough. Gradually, painfully, he took a single step forward, then another. The man remained motionless, letting the Mustang approach on his own. Every muscle in the horse's body was wound tight, ready to flee at the slightest hint of a trick. But none came. The man spoke again, softly, a gentle murmur. The Mustang stretched his neck, sniffing the air around this strange human, picking up sweat, leather, and the faint aroma of grain. His heart thundered as he realized how close he'd come. A single leap would put him out of reach. The man slowly reached into a pouch and withdrew something, a handful of oats, by the smell of it. The Mustang's stomach lurched with longing. Carefully, he edged nearer. The man placed the oats on the ground, then retreated a few steps, giving the horse space. Unsure, the Mustang hesitated, ears pinned back. Finally, he lowered his head, taking quick sniffs. It smelled good, so good. He nibbled, half expecting a sudden grab. But the man stayed still. The taste of oats sent warmth through his battered body. He devoured them, each kernel a burst of nourishment he desperately needed. When he finished, he lifted his head to stare at the man again. The man whispered reassuring sounds and took another small step back, then pointed toward the corral. Cautiously, the Mustang followed at a distance, noticing the gate was open. Inside, the other horses watched with mild curiosity. The Mustang tensed, but the promise of hay overrode his caution. He slipped into the corral, eyeing the flake of hay lying near the trough. His ears flicked back and forth, scanning for danger. The man closed the gate gently, but didn't lock it with heavy chains. The Mustang nearly bolted, but then realized he could still push it open if he really tried. The presence of the man was unsettling, yet not overtly threatening. Slowly, the horse inched toward the hay and began to eat, each bite a relief that coursed through his starved system. The corral horses stepped aside, letting him feed. Perhaps they sensed his desperation. He ate ravenously, half gulping the hay, then moved to the trough for a long drink. The water felt cool and fresh, far cleaner than the storm puddles. He could see the man leaning against the fence, watching him with what looked like concern. The Mustang's flank stung, the dried blood flaking off. He knew the man would notice. Sure enough, the man approached after some time, stepping slowly, palms raised. The Mustang snorted, swishing his tail, but allowed the man to come closer than he would ever have tolerated before. A gentle hand brushed over his neck, then paused near the wound. The man grimaced at the sight of the injury. Although the horse flinched, he didn't lash out. Some intuition told him this human might help rather than harm. The man murmured softly, then retreated, leaving the corral. Relief washed over the Mustang as the man went inside the cabin. He could still run if he wanted to. But the hay was too good, the water too needed, and the chance to rest too precious. After a while, the man returned with a bucket of water and some cloth. Carefully, he approached, letting the Mustang sniff the items. A pungent smell of herbs and antiseptic made the horse pin his ears, but he didn't flee. Gently, the man cleaned the wound, causing the horse to shudder in pain. But it was a different kind of pain than the barbed wire. It was a sting with a purpose, a cleansing that relieved the tightness of dried blood. Throughout the process, the other horses stood nearby, calm. The Mustang found their presence reassuring. They didn't seem alarmed by the man's actions. Gradually, tension leaked from the Mustang's body, replaced by a shaky acceptance. He couldn't run anymore, not in this condition. Maybe, just maybe, he could trust this stranger a little. When the man finished, he stepped back and let the Mustang return to the hay. He patted one of the tame horses, speaking in a low tone as though explaining the situation to both animals. The Mustang watched warily, still not sure what to make of it all. Over the next few hours, the man left the corral gate loosely latched, never forcing the Mustang to stay. The Mustang could have pushed it open and bolted. But each time he considered leaving, hunger and the comfort of this small sanctuary convinced him to remain a bit longer. His instincts shouted that humans were dangerous. Yet nothing about the man's behavior aligned with the cruelty he'd experienced before. Slowly, he relaxed, at least enough to finish the hay and doze in a corner of the corral where soft straw covered the ground. Dusk fell again, painting the valley in hues of purple and blue. The man fed all 3 horses, refilling their water. He stood by the fence, gazing at the Mustang, and seemed to notice the brand on his hip, a brand that marked him as once a free-roaming Mustang captured and then cruelly sold. The man sighed, shaking his head. The Mustang shifted uneasily, remembering that day, the chaos of the roundup, the pen, the fear. Then the memory of the canyon came rushing back. He pinned his ears, adrenaline spiking, but there was no threat here, only the ghosts of the past. Night settled. The Mustang dozed in the corral, stirring whenever the man came to check on the horses. The wound on his flank felt tender but cleaner. He was no longer tortured by thirst or starvation. In the distance, he heard coyotes howling, but they were out there, beyond the perimeter of light from the cabin. Here, inside this fence, he found an unexpected sense of security. A bitter irony. He'd nearly died behind a fence built by a cruel rancher, and now he found a chance to heal behind another fence, but with a man who showed kindness. As dawn approached once more, the Mustang awoke to the rustling of movement in the cabin. The man emerged with a brimming bucket of oats. He poured some into a trough, beckoning softly. The Mustang, still unsure, approached cautiously. The taste of oats was too enticing to resist. He ate, muscles twitching with every sound, but no threat materialized. Over the next couple of days, a subtle routine formed. The man would clean the wound, reapply salve to ward off infection, feed him, and provide fresh water. The Mustang grew stronger, his coat losing some of its dullness. He'd wander the corral, occasionally testing the latch. It wasn't locked. He knew he could go if he wanted, but something kept him close. One morning, he felt the gentle pressure of a halter slip over his muzzle and behind his ears. He tossed his head in alarm, but the man's soothing words and careful hands calmed him. The other horses watched with mild curiosity, as though showing him it was no big deal. The Mustang snorted, stamping a hoof. The man took a single step back, giving him space. Day by day, that halter became less frightening. The man didn't tie him up or force him into a stall. It was simply a way to guide him gently, to check his wound more thoroughly, to brush out some of the caked mud from his coat. Each small act of care chipped away at the horse's deeply ingrained mistrust. Yet, the Mustang still had nightmares. Sometimes he'd jerk awake in the corral, sweat foaming on his neck, eyes rolling with panic. The memory of the rancher's shouting voice, the canyon's suffocating walls, the storm's thunderous roar, and the snapping barbed wire haunted him. In those moments, he'd see the man standing outside the corral, patient, never rushing forward, letting the horse settle on his own. Only after the panic subsided would the Mustang remember he was safe here, at least for now. As the days passed, the wound healed noticeably. New pink flesh formed along the edges, and the swelling reduced. The Mustang's ribs, though still visible, were less stark. He ate steadily, regaining muscle. The man introduced small pieces of apple and carrot, which the Mustang eyed suspiciously at first, then came to relish. Each day, he grew stronger, more alert. The other horses accepted him as part of their little herd, sharing space and feed with minimal fuss. One late afternoon, he stood at the fence, gazing toward the distant horizon. A warm breeze carried the scent of freedom. Part of him longed to roam the open range again, to gallop with the wind in his mane, to never see another fence or brand. Yet, another part acknowledged the reality that he might not have survived without this man's help. The conflicting desires tore at him. He tried nudging the gate latch with his muzzle, which swung open. He could leave, right then. But he hesitated, glancing back at the corral where fresh hay waited, at the man who was stacking wood by the cabin. The Mustang let the gate drift shut again. For the moment, he chose to stay. However, fate had other ideas. It was nearly dusk when the sound of a truck engine rumbled across the valley. The Mustang's head shot up, ears flat. He recognized that low growl of machinery. The man also tensed, wiping his brow and casting a wary glance at the dusty vehicle approaching on the dirt road. The Mustang's heart pounded. Memories of the rancher's hateful face crashed over him. He pawed the ground nervously, nostrils flared. The vehicle drew closer, eventually parking near the cabin. The horse's anxiety was palpable as a tall figure stepped out, a stranger, not the rancher, but carrying an air of grim purpose. Words were exchanged in low tones with the man from the cabin. Their voices carried a tension that set the Mustang on edge. He backed away to the far corner of the corral, ears pinned. The newcomer scanned the horses, his gaze lingering on the Mustang's brand. A flicker of recognition crossed his features. He spoke sharply, gesturing toward the horse. The man from the cabin responded calmly, arms folded, shaking his head. The newcomer grew agitated, voice rising. The Mustang caught snatches of a heated conversation, words like property reward and wild. Fear spiked. Was this man claiming ownership? Had word spread about the Mustang's escape? The Mustang shifted restlessly, eyes rolling, uncertain whether to flee. The man from the cabin raised a hand, trying to soothe him even from a distance. Tension hung thick in the air. The newcomer reached into the truck bed, pulling out a rope. The Mustang's chest tightened with dread. He prepared to leap the fence if necessary, ignoring the sting that might tear his half-healed side. No way was he going back to captivity. The cabin man raised his voice, stepping between the stranger and the corral. A standoff ensued. The newcomer seemed to threaten legal action or worse, while the man from the cabin stood firm, arms spread as though protecting the horse with his body. The corral horses snorted and shifted, sensing the conflict. The Mustang felt adrenaline flood his veins. If the fence gate was forced open, if the stranger tried to lasso him, it would be a fight to the death. Better to risk it all in a leap to freedom. For what felt like eternity, the confrontation teetered on the brink. The newcomer glared, stepping closer to the fence. The Mustang tensed, muscles bunching for an explosive escape. But the cabin man placed a hand on the stranger's chest, stopping him. They exchanged more words. Money changed hands, or at least that's what it looked like. An envelope was shoved into the stranger's grip with a visible mixture of reluctance and determination. The stranger counted something, scowled, but eventually pocketed the envelope. With a final glare at the horse, he muttered a string of curses, then stomped back to his truck. The Mustang watched, ears flicking nervously. The truck started up, spitting gravel as it turned and rumbled away. Only when the dust settled did the cabin man let out a breath, shoulders sagging in relief. He approached the corral, placing a calming hand on the top rail. The Mustang eyed him, still trembling with leftover panic. But the man's soft murmur carried reassurance. He extended his hand with a broken piece of carrot. The horse, chest heaving, eventually inched forward and took it, chewing as fear subsided. The man gently patted his neck. That night, the Mustang stood beneath the stars in the corral, reflecting on the turn of events. He'd been moments away from losing his freedom again, but the man had intervened. It didn't make sense in the horse's world of raw survival, but some part of him understood gratitude. He rested more peacefully, muzzle resting on a soft patch of straw, lulled by the knowledge that at least for now, he was protected. The next day, a decision loomed. He had gained enough strength that his legs felt capable of a Rio run. His wound was nearly scabbed over, no longer seeping. The man brushed him in the morning, a session that once would have been terrifying. Now, the Mustang let the man tend to him, even enjoying the release of tension in his muscles. But as the day stretched on, the horse felt the pull of open spaces calling. Several times he paced by the gate, pushing it open with his muzzle, then letting it swing shut. The man noticed sadness in his eyes. Perhaps he knew that a wild horse's heart could never be fully contained. That evening, the man led his tame horses into the corral, offering them feed. Then he stood by the gate, leaving it unlatched, looking at the Mustang. Without words, the meaning was clear: you can stay, or you can go. The Mustang felt his heart thud against his chest. Part of him had grown attached to this place, to the care that had saved his life. But deeper within, the wild nature beckoned, urging him to find his own destiny beyond any fence. He nickered softly, approaching the gate, glancing between the man and the horizon. In a slow, deliberate motion, the man swung the gate fully open, stepping aside. The Mustang's eyes darted to the rolling land beyond. A gentle wind ruffled his mane. He stepped forward, paused, and turned his head to touch the man's shoulder with his muzzle, a hesitant gesture of connection. The man's hand rose to stroke the horse's neck. Then the Mustang pulled away, a swirl of dust at his hooves. His muscles tensed, and with a powerful kick off the ground, he shot forward into a gallop. Pain flared briefly in his flank, but adrenaline and joy overshadowed it. He heard the man's faint call behind him, something like a farewell, but he didn't look back. He raced across the open pasture, legs stretching out, hooves pounding the earth in a thunderous rhythm that resonated with the heartbeat of freedom. The corral grew smaller in the distance, the cabin just a speck of warmth in the fading light. Wind whipped his mane, carrying the scent of fresh possibilities. For a moment, he was the wild Mustang he'd always been, untamed, unstoppable. He felt alive in every muscle and nerve, the horizon calling him onward. Night fell, and he slowed to a trot, sides heaving. The wound on his flank smarted, reminding him of his limitations. But the sense of sheer exhilaration remained. He'd outrun captivity once more. Yet, somehow, he didn't feel the same anger and fear that had plagued him before. The memory of the man's kindness cut through the bitterness left by the rancher's cruelty. His experiences now were colored by a new understanding. Not all humans inflicted pain. Some offered second chances. Though darkness veiled the land, he continued at a steady walk, following the contours of the terrain. He stopped to graze on patches of grass illuminated by moonlight, sipped from a small stream trickling down from the hills. His body still bore the scars of his ordeal, but his spirit felt renewed. Occasionally, he'd pause and gaze back in the direction he'd come, a wistful feeling stirring. The corral fence, once a symbol of rescue, receded into the past. The man's face lingered in his mind. He didn't regret his choice, but a strange longing hummed in his chest. By dawn, he'd covered miles. He found himself on a rolling plateau dotted with scrub brush and stunted junipers. The landscape was open enough to see any threats approaching. He rested for a while in a hollow between two low ridges, nibbling at tough grasses. The sunrise was brilliant, painting the sky with reds and golds. He breathed in the crisp air, acknowledging that he was still alive, free and healing. The memory of the rancher and the canyon hovered like a distant nightmare, overshadowed now by the promise of an uncertain but self-determined future. Over the next week, he roamed the plateau, discovering a narrow stream that provided a reliable source of water. He grew stronger, his coat regaining a healthy sheen. The scab on his flank peeled away to reveal pink, scarred flesh, but no sign of infection. He learned which patches of grass offered the best grazing, which sheltered nooks shielded him from the wind. Occasionally, he caught sight of other wild horses far off in the distance, silhouettes on the horizon. Each time, his heart pounded with a spark of recognition and longing. One day, perhaps, he might join them. But he wasn't sure if he was ready, not yet. Then, late one afternoon, a new set of clouds rolled in, heavy with the promise of rain. He remembered the terror of that storm in the canyon, the roiling flash flood, the barbed wire fence. A prickle of anxiety twitched along his spine. But he also recalled how that same storm had freed him. As thunder rumbled, he found a semi-sheltered spot in a shallow cave on the lee side of a cliff. He waited as the rain began to fall, a steady patter that softened the earth but lacked the fury of the canyon tempest. He stepped out now and then to let the raindrops wash over his coat, rinsing away lingering dirt and dust, cleansing him of old memories. Night fell, and the storm continued, gentle but persistent. He stood in the mouth of the cave, watching lightning flicker in the distance. The thunder was muted here, less threatening. Somewhere, he imagined the man at the cabin, probably checking on his horses, making sure they were safe from the weather. A curious sense of gratitude flowed through him. In another life, he might have stayed, become a ranch horse or a trusted companion. But deep inside, the call of the wild was stronger. As dawn broke, the storm clouds receded, revealing a glistening world. Every leaf and blade of grass sparkled with drops of water, and small streams had formed across the plateau. The Mustang trotted out, his hooves dampening the soft ground, muzzle lowered to nuzzle the fresh grass. Life brimmed around him, the land infused with new vitality. He felt it in his bones, in the healing scar on his flank, in the renewed strength of his legs. No longer was he the starved, frightened creature left to die in a canyon. He was a survivor. Days turned to weeks, and he wandered further. Eventually, he crested a ridge and looked down upon a sweeping valley filled with wild grasses and a meandering river. A band of wild horses grazed along its banks, mares, a stallion, and a few young. The Mustang's heart soared at the sight. He nickered softly, ears pricked, standing still for a long moment as he watched them. The stallion noticed him, lifting his head. A tense moment passed, but no challenge came. The band was too far for conflict to arise. Slowly, the Mustang descended, his pace cautious. He skirted around the edges of the herd, respectful of their territory. They lifted their heads to observe him, curious but not immediately hostile. He could almost sense an unspoken invitation, a chance to join or at least share the grazing. He approached at a wide angle, offering space. The Maras eyed him warily, but the stallion merely flicked his tail and went back to cropping grass. The Mustang lowered his head and began to graze, close enough to feel the warmth of companionship, far enough not to threaten or intrude. Over the next few days, he inched closer, and the wild horses began to accept his presence. He was no longer alone. The memory of the cabin man's kindness remained with him, a quiet testament that not all fences were malicious. But here, among his own kind, he felt the pull of ancestral freedom. His body filled out more, his coat took on a healthy gleam, and the scar on his flank healed fully, leaving a smooth mark that would forever remind him of what he had endured. He learned the rhythms of the band, where to find the best grass, how to detect approaching predators. The pangs of fear that once ruled him softened into a cautious awareness. One day, while grazing under a bright sun, he froze as a familiar noise rolled over the valley, a truck engine. He and the other wild horses lifted their heads in unison, eyes wide. Far off, dust rose from a dirt track. Heart pounding, the Mustang recognized the shape of a vehicle. Tension rippled through the herd. The stallion snorted, pawing at the ground. Humans approaching meant danger. The Mustang's mind flooded with images of the canyon, the rancher, the brand, the barbed wire. A powerful urge to bolt surged in him. But something else dawned on him. He remembered that not all men were the same. Squinting at the vehicle, he thought he saw a silhouette that looked vaguely familiar. The band of horses began to move, trotting away from the track, but the Mustang hesitated. Could it be the man from the cabin? His heart soared at the possibility. Yet, he wasn't certain, and caution told him to follow the herd. Without second-guessing, he broke into a canter to keep pace with them. Together, they put distance between themselves and the truck, eventually vanishing over a ridge. He never did find out who was in that vehicle. Maybe it was just a passing traveler. Perhaps it was the kind man venturing beyond his homestead, searching for the horse he had saved. The Mustang didn't know. But as the band settled in a distant meadow, he felt a bittersweet stir within. Memories of the cabin man's caring touch, the gentle salve on his wounds, the open gate, proof that some humans possess compassion. Yet here, with the wild horses, he was truly free. A tension existed between gratitude for past kindness and the longing for unbound existence. Ultimately, he found acceptance in this band, forging a new chapter of his life under open skies and endless horizons. Seasons changed. Grass turned golden in the summer sun, rivers ran fuller in spring, and the herd shifted its range according to nature's cycles. The Mustang thrived, muscle returning to his frame. His stamina rebuilt until he could gallop full tilt across wide expanses without faltering. At times, he'd stand on a rise, gazing at the horizon, recalling the canyon's walls, the roaring flood, the night of lightning and terror. He'd lived when he should have died. He'd found a savior in a gentle stranger. And then he'd found his own path back to the wild. One crisp morning, he woke to the distant sound of gunfire reverberating through the hills. The band startled, stomping in agitation. Fear lanced through him. Gunfire meant humans, hunters, or worse. The stallion bugled, gathering the Maras. They sprinted away from the noise in a coordinated rush. Adrenaline surged, and the Mustang joined them, hooves kicking up clods of earth. The thunder of their combined gallop echoed across the valley. They headed for higher ground, a safer refuge where the terrain was rugged, and vehicles could not easily follow. All day, they stayed on edge, ears rotating at every sound. They glimpsed no pursuers, but the tension lingered. Memories of captivity weighed heavily on the Mustang's mind. He was determined never to be corralled like that again. The scar on his flank itched whenever fear flared. Nightfall brought some calm, and the band settled among a cluster of low hills. The Mustang kept watch while others dozed. When the moon rose bright and clear, he relaxed slightly. Dawn arrived with a gentle haze. The gunfire had ceased, and the world felt quiet again. The stallion led them out of the hills, back toward grazing land. The Mustang moved with the group, scanning the horizon. They came upon a broad plateau with scattered sagebrush and short grasses, the wind making ripples across the golden expanse. The Mustang's keen eyes spotted something in the distance, a solitary figure on horseback, not a truck. Alarm prickled, but curiosity rose as well. He saw the figure halt, raising binoculars to scan the horizon. The band hesitated. The stallion stamped. The Mustang recognized the posture of caution. But when the figure's horse neighed softly, the Mustang's heart pounded. It wasn't the rancher's voice or the rancher's style. The figure dismounted, the sun glinting off something, maybe a canteen. A breeze shifted, carrying the faint scent of leather and horse sweat. The Mustang took a few steps forward, ignoring the nervous whinnies of the maras. A wave of longing washed over him. He couldn't be sure, but something about the stance, the quiet demeanor, reminded him of the man from the cabin. Yet, as he moved closer, the stallion nipped at his flank, warning him away from the human threat. Torn, the Mustang pinned his ears, retreating back to the safety of the herd. He watched from a distance as the figure scanned the plain, apparently searching for something, then remounted and rode away, disappearing over a ridge. A pang of bittersweet regret coursed through the Mustang's chest. Another chance? Another near meeting? Fate teased him with echoes of the past. Shaking his mane, he turned his attention back to the band. This was his life now. Despite the ongoing challenges of the wild, predators, storms, the watchful presence of humans, he persevered. Each day, the canyon felt further behind him, the brand on his hip just another mark in his story. At times, he galloped for the sheer joy of it, feeling the wind whip against his face, the ground racing beneath him, hooves drumming a primal beat that spoke of liberation. No fence, no rope, no cage. He was alive. And so, his story rolled onward like the endless grasslands. He roamed with the band, forging alliances, chasing the taste of freedom that had nearly been taken from him. Survival was never guaranteed, nature could be harsh, predators lurked, and human threats were always possible. But the Mustang understood something profound. He had outrun death once, and that knowledge gave him a boldness that burned behind his eyes. On one late summer evening, he stood on a bluff, overlooking a winding river. The setting sun bathed everything in fiery orange. He exhaled, a deep breath that seemed to carry away the shadows of his old fears. Perhaps the man from the cabin was out there somewhere, continuing to rescue lost souls. Perhaps the rancher was still as ruthless as ever, searching for new ways to profit from cruelty. But right now, either of them defined the Mustang's life. He was free to choose each step. The wind shifted, carrying a faint scent of sage and dust, stirring memories of the night he'd broken through the barbed wire in a flood-soaked canyon. He remembered the roar of thunder, the sting of the wire cutting his flesh, the swirling waters that nearly drowned him. He also recalled the gentle hands that cleaned the wound, the open gate that was never slammed shut. A swirl of emotions, fear, gratitude, longing, triumph, flooded him. He whinnied softly, a sound carried off by the breeze. There was no fence around him now, no barrier left to surmount except the boundaries of his own will. As dusk gave way to a star-filled sky, he felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. He had endured hunger, pain, storms, predators, and the cruelty of men. Yet here he stood, healthier than he'd been in a long time, heart thrumming with a quiet certainty that he belonged to the wilderness. The savage beauty of the land was his home, and no fence would hold him again. He turned from the bluff and cantered back toward the grazing herd, each hoofbeat a testament to his unbreakable spirit. Life would continue to challenge him, but survival was etched into his very bones. And if there was any final thought that lingered in his mind as he drifted off to sleep under the sprawling heavens, it was that sometimes, even when abandoned and left to starve, one could find unexpected compassion and a second chance. He had seized that chance, wresting life from the jaws of death. Now, with the open sky above and endless possibilities before him, he was free to live on his own terms. If this story gripped you, like and subscribe for more intense survival tales. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know in the comments.